Hi, I'm Denise.
And I'm Tom.
And welcome to our podcast, Because We've Been in Your Shoes.
We created our podcast for you, our nonprofit colleagues. As nonprofit professionals with over 50 years of experience combined, we've led nonprofit hospitals, university programs, campaigns that have transformed cities, communities, and campuses. We're from Chicago and Detroit, and now we're in the Pacific Northwest. Our work has taken us across the country from the Midwest to Seattle, to Portland, California, and nationally. We've seen it, lived it, and have learned from it.
We've all been through a lot as nonprofit professionals, and we hear you, we see you, and we understand. We know you, too, are used to wearing many hats. It can be exhausting, but we come together with the shared mission to transform the world. Because We've Been in Your Shoes is a podcast for you, us, and our entire nonprofit community, sharing and learning from one another so we can continue to innovate and unleash capacity for good. We'll hear from colleagues and peers, discuss emerging issues in the sector, and provide you with key takeaways and useful tips to support you in all you do. We believe that people and philanthropy equal possibilities. Join us on the Because We've Been in Your Shoes podcast with new topics and special guests. Thank you for joining us for the conclusion, and here's where we left off. You mentioned something about organization culture, and can we maybe shift our conversation into EDI work and organizations that operate like that, nonprofit organizations that take on a more, I guess you could say, corporate culture, staff and especially new emerging leaders in the space are looking for boundaries. And we talk oftentimes also about setting boundaries in the workplace, being able to give yourself, Tom and I have talked about mental health and wellness. We're, in the nonprofit space, it's also part of the retention and recruitment challenges is what kind of environment do you support people to check in when they need to and check out when they need to as well, and be able to be a part of creating and shifting the culture from a very high intense stress environment into one that has more balance and more boundaries and respect. Could you speak to that? Are you seeing that also in the for-profit sector, and maybe from your perspective of serving on nonprofit boards? What are you seeing?
I am. So from a variety of perspectives, and I do think that the pandemic, along with a lot of the focus on racial justice during that time frame, I think has really sort of shifted a lot in terms of how sort of our dialogue has shifted. In some ways healthy, and certainly in the political spectrum, some ways unhealthy. And I think we all understand that we don't need to go into that. But within sort of the organizational perspective is, I think we're more in tune to the individual experience, right? To people being able to bring in their identity and come into work, to people being more open to the reality that everyone needs to care for their mental health. There was a time when we didn't focus on physical wellness, and it became a thing. It was like a trend. In the past 25 years during my human resources experience, that came to be because there wasn't a lot of focus on physical wellness. And so now we're talking a little bit more about mental wellness and all of the things that sort of impact and apply to it. And we realize that there's so many different spectrums, but for an organization just to listen and care and to be mindful, and teaching your managers, you don't need to have managers be experts, but what they need to be is create an inclusive environment that welcomes all and allows all space to sort of deal with their own experience, whether that experience be because of things that they're going on at home, or inclusivity and issues of the organization sort of evolving from a diversity and equity and inclusion perspective, which is certainly, I think that there's a lot of research on the weight of mental health wellness on, we'll call them marginalized communities or less represented communities in the workforce. And, one of my nonprofit experiences, I got a chance to be an executive coach at an organization called Management Leadership for Tomorrow that focuses on leaders of color recently. And we had a leadership week, and hearing their experiences, and these are highly accomplished leaders of color. They're already, but well accomplished. And now the idea is to kind of continue them on their path. Listening to their experiences in more often than not, it was the for-profit world, although there were some nonprofit leaders there as well. Their experience coming up in organizations that didn't look a lot like them, and what they had to do to sort of modify that. And that's why there are these like conflicts. So we say we want to give people space and not have to do more than what's required, to not have to give up so much in their personal life perspective from a balance. And you hear these individuals saying, well, they had no choice, but they had to give that because that was the only way they were going to succeed, because they could give nothing in terms of being allowed that flexibility. They always had to be sort of on top of their game, or at least that was their interpretation of what was required to be successful. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it was just an
No, yeah,
interesting.
no, I mean, obviously the idea of you have to fit the mold, or that culture fit idea, that what is that organization's culture? And, that's just, I think does not work anymore, just because you share that, oftentimes leaders of color, and especially also women particularly, from my perspective, it's always been like, oh my god, do they think I'm going to leave because I'm going to have another child, or I'm going to get married and I'm not, as committed. And that's kind of a stress factor that's in the back of your mind all the time, because it's like, if I don't perform at that function. And I've worked in university environments, and higher, not just higher ed, but in healthcare, large corporate healthcare. And it was always this kind of corporate culture that drove, and it was always like, I have to go for, take my daughter to a medical appointment. It's not that I'm not engaged in my job, but, those inabilities to be able to just say, you know what, I have to take my daughter to the doctors. I'm going to come back. I mean, it was just really hard to also navigate, because that perception that your colleagues are like, you're not working as hard, you're not present, you're not, advancing those numbers or reaching your goals. And there's excuses that people also put on you. You don't necessarily always know what they are, but they'll just say, oh, she's a mom, or she's getting married, or, all of those typical issues that women are placed under. I think also are just challenging, whether you're in the for-profit or nonprofit space too. And I think it just takes more EDI training and
Yeah.
helping to break some of those biases down. And then also
Yeah.
maybe investment in really kind of supporting colleagues, as you said, from the physical wellness. I remember working at places where exercising and reducing our cholesterol intake was reducing and improving our heart health. And then now shifting into mental wellness. I think it's long overdue, but definitely leaders of color, I think, and especially women, I think value having that discussion, because so often, as I think all of us as first generation, there's community trauma too that you bring into your work, especially just racial injustices that have been a part of some people's cultures and backgrounds. That stuff is carried forward in everything you do. And having a place that recognizes that and creating space for that, I think, is hopefully an organization where people want to stay and continue to contribute to that environment, so that other colleagues feel more included.
Yeah, that's key. The included, right? It only goes like if you use that as your foundational word, the inclusion, then you have no, if you really want women in the workforce in higher numbers and in higher positions and in broadly represented, replace any demographic you want to, but let's just use women as that example, then you have no choice if you're going to be successful, but to change up the way you operate so that you are inclusive and you allow that flexibility so that any woman feels welcome and included in the organization. Same thing for people of color, same thing for really anyone with any background that comes in, and they know that there's empathy and there's flexibility in how they might operate, that their situation is acknowledged, that they can be seen
Mhm.
in their way, and it doesn't have to fit the way the majority of the organization fits or looks like. Because I think a lot of organizations focused on diversity for a long time, and what you got was some organizations who did it well, they were very diverse, but they had huge turnover and disproportionately among certain populations because they didn't really attend to that aspect of it.
I love that perspective. Thank you so much. I appreciate hearing that, especially from someone as an executive that's working with people and building the infrastructure to not just recruit, but to retain and make people feel connected to each other, and to their work. Thank you for that.
You bet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jorge, I do want to touch on the coaching because you mentioned mental health. So I want to go to that, but I need to ask you something. I'm not sure how you identify yourself, person of color, whatever it may be. Can you talk a little bit about how you identify yourself and some of your experience, negative, positive, and how you
Yeah,
navigated that?
that's fair. I'm gonna I'm going to walk through that through a couple of different lenses. So coming up, so the name Jorge. So I was called George, by the way, as a child, and my family still calls me George in a lot of ways. My dad is also Jorge, and in business, he was Jorge with Spanish-speaking people, and he was George with non-Spanish-speaking people. And that was sort of, I think assimilation that existed that sort of impacted me. And in a lot of ways, I realized that there was a certain sort of, I don't think I acknowledge these terminologies the way they do today, but probably a code switching to some degree that to be successful in business, you had to sort of fit the mold. And so, coming up,
Yep.
there were probably more Latinos. I consider myself Latino. I think everyone's got their terms, right? I don't know as much about Latinx because to me, I'm just Latino. And I consider myself a son of immigrants. And the immigrant experience, I think, is a very important part of my story. And I look at what my parents and, my parents' story and like coming into the country and having to learn English and being really on the low rung of the life, right? In the United States, when you don't know English,
Yep.
is an experience that you learn from. And, my dad would tell me these stories of being work at, the only place he could work were kitchens because he didn't speak the language. And, menial labor kind of, as you stepped up and learned the language, you could move up from there. Going into business, I realized, well, I started calling myself Jorge later, a little bit later in life, like high school, college timeframe, and I started to sort of adopt that. But still, I realized I did a little code switching in business and coming up in human resources where diversity and inclusion are like core, well beyond, I think, the broader marketplace. I had a little struggle, if I'm honest with you, a little conflict because I didn't want to seem self-serving. And so, focusing on diversity because I didn't want one to be self-serving and I never wanted anyone to question my qualifications and that I earned the role that I got. And that in a lot of ways drove a lot of my view. And I came to terms with that, by the way, a few years ago during this whole kind of racial justice awakening in the post-George Floyd era that I realized that I probably hadn't done enough as a human resources leader and driving some of those conversations because me as a leader was toning it back, realizing that I was not fulfilling, my connection to my background and coming up entirely as myself. And that I realized that I was coming up certain ways, like with my own team, I was probably 100% myself, but with my executive peers, I shifted a little bit in how I interacted with them. And I realized that was something that I just had to kind of adjust and evolve so that I can put full effort and focus into this conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, whatever concept you want to throw in there. And it's really helped me grow. I would say I've grown more in that space in the last couple of years. And, that is really connected to all of sort of what I've evolved to. I'm a big believer in you're always growing, right? I don't care if you're 40 years into your career, you continuously are focusing on your growth. And for me, getting into coaching, and I got certified in DEI during that time frame as well because I wanted to learn more. And I think part of, people call about you got to do the work, right? Part of that work is having the discussion. Part of that work is just talking through it, which I know, Tom, you and I and some of our friends have these conversations regularly. It's bringing that conversation beyond those borders and inviting people into that conversation. In some cases, it's uncomfortable and making it more comfortable to continue to ask difficult questions and also be in a position to hear difficult responses because that's part of the conversation as well.
I want to ask, and I'll ask this of Tom too. Since you have those conversations and both of you as men and men who identify as leaders of color, I just curious, specific to what you mentioned, Jorge, at what point did you say, I'm no longer George? I struggled with this. I remember in kindergarten, they gave me a different name, Denise T, removed my entire, name, which was my identity. And so it was really hard for me. And it wasn't until we moved to another community that had more first generation immigrant families that I felt confident to say, no, it's actually not my name. But even in resumes over the years, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, I reverted to Denise. I wasn't using my full name. It was because I was not getting calls back. And even though I went to an amazing university, University of Michigan, and, was a, high performing student all through academics, that seemed not to translate. But it wasn't until the last 5 to 7 years where I own my identity and I recognize my name as my identity, and I don't want someone to change it, and I don't need to alter it. What was it for you? And then Tom, if you could share, what was it for you, Jorge? What made that change for you?
Um, I would say there probably wasn't a flipping of the switch, but more so like an evolving thing. I mean, I had started in high school. I remember when I changed high schools my sophomore year, middle of the sophomore year. So
That's
when you
hard.
go in and you're like the new kid that it's like you're coming in brand new and all the people are looking at you in class. And the first kid who met me knew that my name was spelled and was pronounced Jorge because everyone else had called me George. And I was like, don't call me that. That's not my name. And I had to, like, little by little, it became like a nickname and it was fun. And as I kind of used that to embrace, so that was, I would say, a pivotal moment for me that I started to embrace my culture more so. Some of my Latino peers call it Latinidad, right? I started to embrace my Latinidad, the language. I knew Spanish and I had learned Spanish because of my Colombian roots. And I didn't care for people putting me in a box. I will tell you that because there's a large percentage of Mexican Americans in the U.S., people automatically assumed that I had a Mexican culture. And to me, the broad strokes of Latino culture and probably any culture are really not healthy. Like even when we pair what we call black and brown people together, we're missing the opportunity for the individual identity. And that's important. I'm Latino,
Hmm.
but I'm also so many other things. And I'm so different than probably other Colombians. My experience is different than other Latinos. It took me a long time to figure that out and realize it. And I still, I still get irritated sometimes when people make assumptions. I get called a lot of names, by the way, when you talk about your experience. Your name is, I mean, even last week, someone called me Juan. I've been called Jose a million times. I've been called
Yeah.
Javier, a lot of J names. And I chalk it up to maybe they don't have as many experiences as Jorge. There's more in baseball nowadays, but there's still not a lot of Jorges around. And so, and there's a lot of Latinos that are Jorge that go by George as well. And so it's funny, more often than not, a lot of Latinos call me George, which I'm fine with because my family still calls me George in a lot of ways. But it's been an evolving thing. And I find myself more over the last couple of years being more comfortable with my peers of talking about my Colombian roots, of using my Spanish, of even making fun a little bit. I'll say something in Spanish in an all English speaking crowd, and to me it's fun, and I'll try and use that to sort of lighten the level of intensity when you're talking business, and that's worked well. And I realized that if I'm with the right level of peers, right group of peers, they embrace it. I can't say all my peers have always embraced it, and I've made changes in my career because of that. If I'm honest with you.
Yeah, that's a hard place to make that change when your work environment doesn't embrace all of who you are and what you bring to the
Yeah.
table.
Yeah, I agree with Jorge, you said, but work environment. I think about something else because my experience, so my full name, and then as we've talked about, my full name, Jorge knows this, Sylvian Thomas Bull, right? I hated that first name growing up. I hated that name beyond.
I love that name.
But you know what? When you grew up in America in the 70s, my parents are Belizean. They wanted to fit in, and that was extremely
Yeah.
important for them, right? So they didn't even speak Creole around me. So we never picked up the language. So, and then you're teased a lot by your friends and by communities, and your teachers, as you mentioned, will change your name. So I
Yeah.
remember Sylvian, they called me everything except, so it was Sybil, Sylvania, Sylvia, Sally. I mean, it was
Oh
really
Wow.
gosh.
bad because they could not pronounce the name. So I
Yeah.
started moving towards using my middle name, which is Thomas. Then I went to Tom. And then in high school, everyone calls you by your last name. So that was acceptable. But I always thought my name was very odd, Sylvia and Thomas Bull. It's only been in the last, I think when I was working in a company called Beatrice Companies, they put my name on one of the, name tags as Sylvia and Thomas Bull. And I thought I need to change that. And it was a maintenance guy came in. He was doing some work on our printer. He looked at my name. He goes, "Oh, that's a cool name." And I remember I just turned and looked at the name, and I thought to myself, "That is a cool name." And I started digging into the history of that name. And once I found the history of it, I just thought it was just an amazing name. And now I've come to appreciate it. I still use Tom. Or hey, you mentioned about code switching. I don't think I understood the name game for years. And I'm going to say in the last 10 years, when I read an article about this gentleman by the name of Jorge, blah, 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 engineering background, he could not get a name. Then he switched his name to Joe. And guess what? he got a job.
You got a job.
Calls were coming in for him.
Yeah.
And that was only in the last time I'm like, oh my God, what if I would have used Sylvia and what would have happened? It's only when I get into a job, I will, they will say, oh, is that your name? And something like that. And so anyway, that's been,
Yeah.
so I do appreciate my name. I do understand, I think more than anything else, my family are Belizean. So technically I'm Belizean. I grew up in America. I was born here and grew up here. Culturally, I connect to African American and what the Black experience is. What I'm finding out is that a lot of people that I would have considered Black, they do not use that term. They do not connect to it. Belizeans will not use the term Black. People from Zimbabwe, they do not use the term Black because how I think America associate what being Black is in the Black experience. So a lot of countries, a lot of people that I would consider Black, they won't associate with that. Which Jorge, you brought up in many ways, I think is, yes, why wouldn't they associate with their country, their culture, and so forth? They want their names out there, their names known, right? So I get it. But it's too bad that something like that has happened where as a community of Black people, we don't do that anymore. For me, it's like, wow, what a loss to bring us all together. But I do recognize, Jorge, what you said about definitely yes, I will say that you lose something when you put people into those pots like that. You will lose something. You lose your history, your culture. You lose something. So I think it's important that it is, that we do connect to whatever our history is. And if we still connect to what being Black is for me or African American, that's important too.
How do you answer that, Jorge? Like when your teams and how you do that, what kind of training, especially for nonprofits who oftentimes have staff at all levels doing interviews that don't have that experience, what kind of advice or tips do you give, or where can they find how to better recruit and interview so that you're legally but culturally also mindful of some of the biases that your interviews have?
Yeah, to me, it's a difficult challenge because to me, those are table stakes, right? Those are basics that you have to sort of understand, structurally how to stay in compliance. So some of those are legal questions, right? So you have to stay in compliance with the law. I think what helps though, so I don't have a good answer for you, Dennis, on like what is the best way to do that, because I think you just have to find a way to do it and get resources, and there's a lot of free resources out there. Society for Human Resources Management is really easy to get a lot of access, basic policy data, and those kinds of things on what are good interview questions. But I think if you create culturally a strong values system and you really focus on the inclusivity, then it forces you to not have pre-established answers to questions that are going to automatically sort of be the right answer, if you will. So it creates a little bit of I'll call it a more sensitivity or empathy in the interview process, where even if you didn't know that a question is not legally like wrong or right or whatever, but that that you're trying to give that person space to come in fully as themselves. So you don't predispose their answers to your own biases. And I would say the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion has, I think, resulted in more people thinking about their biases. And, the only way you can fix sort of your implicit biases is to sort of put a light on them. And they're not going to go away completely, right? Everybody's got them. Everybody has got them. The human brain cannot operate without some level of sort of predetermined sort of aspects. But the more you question that, the more you allow a broader thinking and a critical thinking from that perspective. So to me, if you have a strong enough values and you show it that way, then you're going to get a better natural outcome than if you just only focus on just the sort of compliance related, here's what's legal and here's what's not in terms of questions. Hopefully that gives you some sense. I was thinking about an article I just read. It came out in this week's Harvard Business Review. I barely read it, but I literally just read it yesterday. I had this right on my desk. So it says, what does your company really stand for? And it goes into companies' values.
Oh, I love that.
And it goes into companies' beliefs. And it sort of differentiates beliefs from values in that your values are like, those are black and white, right? The company's values are black and white, but your beliefs might be different paths to achieve, living through those values. And that's where you have to give those different beliefs a place and a space in an organization to ultimately make up those values. If you only think that the values can look one way, then you're going to have a monoculture and you're not going to get a lot of diversity and you're going to ask the wrong questions in interviews, and you're going to get the wrong, you're not going to get enough other people wanting to come there to work there. And you're probably going to rule out a bunch of people who might just have come to the interview anyway, because you're going to rule them out and say, oh, they're not a good culture fit in the organization.
So if your value, is this a belief or a value that, well, I guess we value gender equity in the workplace, or would that be more of a belief? We believe,
I think that's a value.
That's a value.
That's a value. How you achieve gender equity in the workplace is a belief, and there's probably various ways. Okay. And that's why, where we've lost in the political dialogue is that there's a lot of different ways, but because there's so much one-sidedness, is that you're ruling out sort of the dialogue. What's the best way to achieve gender equity? There's probably a lot of different ways to sort of move the needle. No one's ever going to move it overnight. And so because you're trying to balance, how do you change your organization? Because if you need more of it today, it means you weren't doing enough of it yesterday. So you have to sort of acknowledge, we got work to do. We got improvements to make, which means you have to sort of break down some things that were working before. And in some people's view, they were bought into those things. And they might think that you're breaking other things that have nothing to do with gender equity by doing that. And so that's where the dialogue, you have to allow for those beliefs to come in and say, if you're all in agreement that we need gender equity in the organization, well, no, let's just have a good dialogue about moving the needle in that direction and figuring that out. So that would be my answer. I'm sure different people might answer it differently, but that's my view.
Thanks for that clarification between the two.
So let me start shifting over to coaching, because we have, we've been talking a lot, but I want to shift over to coaching. Why? Is because, Jorge, you brought it up, and I know Dinesh and I have talked about this, is mental health. And we saw during the pandemic, counseling, psychiatrists, psychologists, coaching went off the boards. Right? And so, Jorge, you're not only a coach, but start first with, tell me if you've ever been coached yourself. What did you get out of that?
So I have been coached both informally and formally, but having been certified a couple of years ago as an executive coach taught me some things that I was really surprised by. So having been a human resources leader for many years, I kind of felt like, oh, I've been coaching, I've been doing this, right? And what I was seeking was the credential. I'm like, I just want something to say that I'm an executive coach. So let me go through the certification process and do that. And what I learned was that what I had been doing in a lot of ways was giving people advice. People were coming into my office, I was giving them advice. And really, for a good coach to be successful is you're doing a lot less of advising, and what you're doing a lot more is asking questions and helping that person come to their own sort of options. Now, you're providing some structure and you're providing some guidance through that process, but you're not advising them and you're not telling them what to do. And so that was really insightful for me. And now I go back to the first time I had a coach, which was in 2010. And 2010 was when I had a huge amount of development. I would call that the year that I realized that up until that time, I had been trying to be really, really just flawless. And I was ambitious. So I wanted to grow my career. I didn't want to give anybody a reason to knock me down in my career. And because of that, it was inconvenient for me to face my own flaws. And what having a coach helped me do is really to shine the light on self-awareness and realize that the only way I was going to grow was by continuously focusing, not just on flaws, but just understanding myself, understanding the things and my strengths and my style and all of these things that would help me to sort of put a mirror and realize, here's the things I need to adjust to be successful in my next thing. And in 2010, I had a coach that helped me do that a lot, along with the 360 exercise and a number of other things that helped me do that. And that was, a couple of years before I ended up getting my first, what I would call my first chief HR role. And I had a coach also during my coaching certification process that helped me really unlock some things that were just things about my own experiences that really helped me to grow and evolve. And so I see that process of asking challenging questions, helping a person, I call it shining a light in the areas that you don't typically shine your lights on, of helping a person sort of to unlock those things and helping them come out. And I realized that through questioning, you find out something, a lot of times people don't ask you a lot of questions. Think about your own experience with your own boss or your own workplace. People don't ask you questions. So there might be things like you have all jumbled up in the back of your head that you don't talk about because no one's asking you. And unless you have a reflective process of journaling or something that just helps you get it out, chances are you're probably not getting that out as often as you probably could or should to use that in a productive way. So that's a lot of sort of me long-winded way of saying, what I think coaching has been key to me going into it and also to my own experience.
And then you said something, I was going to ask this question, but you already answered it. The difference between advising and coaching. That's so important that our audience understand that. But Jorge, what have you found that you were getting coached, now you're coaching? Tell me, what are you getting out of it?
So is that every situation is entirely different and every individual is entirely different. And I'm also realizing that through that process, people are you have to be very careful about drawing a line between therapist and coach, right? Because a therapist operates in similar ways. They ask a lot of questions. They're trying to get a person to sort of bring out what's inside. To be having a good coaching engagement, you also want to do something similar. You don't want it to be therapeutic. I'm not trying to be therapeutic in their way. They might be self-therapeutic for their way, but so I find so much value, and I've not done it a long time in this since I've been certified. I think historically, I would say I was advising and mentoring a lot of people, and now what I found is that taking people that are already professionally successful and recognizing and helping them sort of pick at their opportunities through this process of asking them questions is you end up seeing a lot of aha moments, and it's really been fulfilling and rewarding for me personally to see some of those journeys and to help someone take their own self-awareness to the next level through that process. And I have no doubt, and I don't need to advise them to tell them how to move their next chapter in their career, because they're figuring stuff out that's going to be right for them. And it might not all look the same way. And what you're realizing is that sometimes you get to a certain level in organizations, especially senior levels, when you start getting like calling yourself director and VP and C-level, everyone else tends to sort of stop the focus on that person's development. They're just expecting them to sort of just drive and execute and lead. And what you realize is because of that lack of focus in organizations on those senior people is that they've been neglected in a lot of ways.
Is that where the burnout is?
I think so. I think there's a lot of burnout at that level. And, people operate like they've had to be successful for so many years. And sometimes they're riding on their own growth experience, what they believed was needed to be successful. Sometimes they have like maybe a foundational educational experience, or they went through an MBA process previously or something that kind of helped them sort of drive, and they lean on that a lot. But without that area of focus, you don't get to sort of a customized view of what needs to happen for that individual. And so that's why, what the way that's translated organizationally is organizations love to do sort of flavor of the month leadership programs. Let's make it off of this book, or let's make it off of this program. And I've just been of the view of, you can make a foundation over one thing, but you have to make it broad enough that it speaks to many people, and it gives you a variety of things, because every individual is unique and will react differently to some of those things. And the only way you can get that is through just interaction and coaching. The problem is it's time consuming for people, and it's expensive for people to kind of go through that process and take it away from their work. And so trying to do that in a way that makes sense has been challenging. I've tried to, make accommodations to make myself available to people outside of that coaching experience so that I can continue to help them on their journey along the way. And that's it's rewarding for me. I've enjoyed it. But I also just love watching people grow. It's been, that's why I'm an HR person. I think that's the biggest.
Now, one thing you did say, Jorge, and I just want to bring this up, the coaching area.
I have one question related to that, just on the coaching piece, because, Tom is an executive too. I'm just throwing out the idea, do people feel intimidated to hire or work with an executive coach? Because do they see it as a sign of weakness, or not really a good manager? I don't have the trained background or skills. Like, what are some of the challenges you think that prevent people from getting an executive coach, and maybe share why you encourage people getting that more often to address burnout too?
What Dinesh just said.
Sure.
Also, this is along the same line. People have got to be ready. Add all that together, what she said. And
yeah. So first of all, I think part of the intimidation is that you put executive in front of coach, and I do that too, right? And I'm sure it makes me feel good about myself, whatever. But the idea is, in the sort of evolution of people development, the word coaching was misinterpreted for many years, right? Is that you only coached when there was a problem. And also there's different views of coaching. You think about coaching in athletics is very different than what I'm describing as coaching in this coaching
Yes.
process. When you're in athletics, it's definitely like the coach's way is developing a system, and they're definitely telling you what to do and to perform on the team. I would say in my career, when I saw coaching being used and executive coaching being used, there was a time when people used it or companies took the investment because they thought they needed to fix a problem or fix an issue. And I think that's evolved quite a bit. There's probably people that still think that way. More often than not, people see this as the next level of development that isn't available to people probably earlier in their career because you don't have enough focus and individualization. And I think organizations will push to try and figure out how to get coaching skills inside the organization further down to help people evolve in a more individualized way. Because what organizations do is they have classes, right? They have a program they have people sign up for. I think that whole process is intimidating. The motivation, and I definitely have had some people that I've coached that I think they question the motivation of their boss in signing up for the coach. And that's why it was important to me. And if I'm working with a company that's a client, is asking, well, what are your goals in this process? And sometimes it's clear, well, I want them to work on this. But I always ask the individual, well, what do you want to work on? And I always make sure there's alignment on the goals. But I start to focus on the individual. And I've had, unfortunately, situations where the company is paying me, and through the process, we're finding out that person recognizes that they're a wrong fit in the organization culturally, that they are having difficulty with their own view, their own identity, and feeling comfortable in the organization and working through that. And there's been, some of those sort of aha moments in that process. And that's just the process of just self-awareness and self-development that I think just comes out naturally. But you got to get over the idea of that it's just to fix things. It's really to continuous the evolution of growth. And I think everyone needs to get comfortable with the idea that we all need it. We all need to make an adjustments as far as in your career, even if you're very senior, even if you're the CEO, that you still need to continuously focus and hone because nobody's perfect. And that's mantra: progress over perfection. That's what I call my coaching company. Is it's all about the progress.
Well, we're definitely going to share with our audience some of the tips, but also some of those links. So thank you, Jorge. And as we wrap up, Tom, continued questions that you might have? I want to be.
No. I'm sure there are going to be more questions in our audience, and we can always get back to Jorge. Jorge Diaz, we would love to bring you back at one point in the near future. And so thank you for being part of this. So appreciate you being part of this. And I was going to say, go Loyola, but go Loyola.
Yes, definitely. Loyola Ramblers.
Go Blue.
Awesome basketball season. Thank you both so much for including me in this process. And I would say to any of your audience, to me, it's how we get value through the networks that we work in. And so if I could be of assistance or service to anybody, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. But I would love to come back at some point and continue the conversation or take it in whatever direction you want to. But thank you again.
Before you go, Jorge, tell us your coaching organization again. Share that with the audience.
It's a Progress Over Perfection group. And I named that, and it's my own organization. Don't think it's a huge group. It was me, my wife, and my kid helping sometimes. But I was doing that full time for a little while, and then I went back into full time. So I take on a few coaching engagements a year, but it helps me continue that. And of course, I do coaching. I think wherever I can, not as official engagements inside the companies that I work in.
Well, I love that you have that expertise that you bring from your professional practice and have dedicated, it sounds like, just a commitment to also bring more inclusive mindset and approach to the organizations where you're affecting and impacting change. So having a leader like you join us, we're so excited. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Because We've Been in Your Shoes.
Join us next time as we share, advocate, and highlight experiences and ideals from nonprofit colleagues, leaders, and champions.
Subscribe to Because We've Been in Your Shoes podcast and be the first to hear our new episodes introducing new topics and guest speakers. Remember, nonprofit friends, you're not alone because we've been in your shoes.